Hello, in this video, I'm going to continue the series that we've been doing with racial cap and space privatization. Like I've kind of said in all the videos, I think that this is a really important resolution, not only because I think that the conversations are really important to just like things that are happening around the world. Like I think that like space and like thoughts about like what the role that like space serves and like thinking about like human life and stuff like that is super important. I also think it's a resolution that like continues to show up in debate for a reason as arguments that kind of like innovate across time. And I definitely think that I really enjoy kind of like having a place to be able to kind of talk about some of the core critical literature based arguments that are kind of going to show up on the resolution, and being able to talk about the various ways that they kind of like lend themselves to different forms of debates in different places. And so I kind of want to continue that with this series as we kind of get really close to rounding out the end of the racial capitalism series by continuing the conversation that we started in the last video about like what racial capitalism as a negative strategy looks like versus other critical teams. I think that this is a really important negative strategy to kind of have in your toolbox on this resolution, because I think that you need to have a negative argument that is able to access being able to refute affirmatives that move both into the kind of like more pessimistic spot of just refusing like space exploration or something positive as a whole, but you also need to be able to have like really good link arguments and solid offense against like all of the affirmatives that kind of be offering alternative visions of futurism. And so being able to kind of like have ways in which you can kind of like fight on both ends of that and be able to have offense that kind of uniquely is generated against both places is, I think, really important to have like a good kind of like topic here for the resolution, and what I think will kind of be the core of like good negative strategies from the critical literature basis here. I definitely think that to kind of like continue where we left off in the last video, which you should watch if you have not, we're kind of like at the link debate, kind of figuring out how to like make this stuff work in a world. We've kind of like settled a lot of the questions for the framing the thesis debates earlier on. I think that when you're kind of like considering what you should be doing with the link debate here, like I said before, it kind of like it kind of depends on these kind of like three types of affirmatives that I've kind of been talking about throughout this like two-part series, which is affirmatives that just kind of like refuse space exploration as like a good thing as a whole, the more like pessimistic affirmatives that will just kind of like say no to the idea of just like whiteness being able to access the moon, or like the idea of just futurism being like a good kind of ethic that we should relate ourselves to as a whole. Then you have the kind of like second tier of arguments, which will be like arguments about like why, like how we are able to remold the future and do space exploration differently by refuting like privatized space exploration as necessary for redefining what the public is and like how we relate to each other effectively in order to change the means in which we go into the space, which changes kind of the cultural values that are being imported like from the world in which we currently live in. And then you have like another tier of responses, which is then like how can we like not only refuse privatized space exploration, but what does it mean for us to really like alienate ourselves from the idea of being human in order to change the way in which we relate to like space colonization as a whole, and like what are like the means in which that kind of like alienation changes the way in which we relate to the question of like what the human is and its role, and like the way in which we define our politics and other types of means of like coming together. And I think all of those are really important arguments to really have linked debates for. I think against the first set of affirmatives that like I talked about in the last video, it's really important to just have arguments about why like refusal and the idea of not being able to look towards something like space as an important conversation also kind of like allows for this kind of like alt-right like white takeover of these conversations, which result in the inevitable colonization of space and make it impossible for us to kind of like do the work of kind of like refusing the ways in which humanism is able to monopolize and universalize itself even outside of like the bounds of the earth, which I think is like a really important like set of impacts and uniqueness that you can weigh against them to make your alternative seem a lot better. But I think against these like last two affirmative types of affirmatives, a lot of the arguments that you really want to offer are ways that you can kind of like create a argument about like why they're kind of like over investment in the future is something that kind of becomes sanitized by like these private entities still serving as like medias for how they're able to access those futures. The idea that a lot of these affirmatives kind of like think of in terms of like over utopianizing, over romanticizing the types of subjects that are able to exist in a society that colonizes space differently or accesses space differently is one that like still attempts to kind of like find ways of creating like able-bodied kind of like universalized communities where like everyone has a universal relationship to community in such a way that creates and perpetuates the same forms of like hegemonic violence that are produced by like the language of the human. And so the alien kind of becomes its new own like hegemonic force, and like their version of the future becomes this like romanticized kind of like fiction that various other entities are able to come over and not only like grant as like financial mediums, but also able to replicate in their own means, thus accelerating the processes of space colonization that they try to like refuse. And so I think there are a lot of arguments to be made about like why this imagery as a whole should be something that should just be refused on the terms of which it kind of like is conditioned by like other forms of like structural violence in the first place. I then think that when you go over to questions of like how you should be considering the permutation, this is the place where I think you need to be like the strongest, because I feel like so many teams are going to hedge their bet on just being like, even if their future isn't perfect, it's better than the status quo, and they cannot access a lot of the organizing principles that whatever alternative you read is really going to do. And so I think that be getting specific into what you want your alternative to accomplish and being able to build specific arguments about why they kind of can't access like really nuanced net benefits and examples from your alternatives because of the way in which they invest in particular values for like what the space and like for what space is alienating the human looks like are incredibly important for like building like strong permutation blocks as a whole. And then I think combining that with kind of like taking some of the framing arguments we've made about like why the specific contestation of what vision and like articulation and relationship we take up to space being super important for like guiding public dialogue and stuff like that into the future is like really important for like making things like forced decisions and other stuff like that I think is overall just like really important for you kind of like making the judge believe that they kind of like have to make a choice between the affirmative and the negative, even if there is some like level of commensurability between the kind of like methods that are being offered. I then think that when you kind of like switch over into how you're able to kind of use things like the impact comparison alternative portion of the debate, I definitely think that you'll probably have like more of the weight for racial capitalism to be able to access a lot of material impacts that are produced just by that kind of like investment into such like a value system that could export itself into another world. And so in that world, I think that it's not just a question of whether or not you outweigh the other team, but like why the specific kind of like focus on materiality and the role that these material impacts serve in the way in which the judge views their impact is the important for kind of sealing the deal and like making your impact comparison matter in terms of not just having the impacts in the debate. But I think then the next level is like proving that there is a relationship between those impacts and the alternatives kind of organizing principle that does something better, faster, and more efficient than the way the affirmative is able to solve theirs. And in that world, all the links that you win are just net benefits to like proving that the alternative just has a better orientation to the world than the affirmative does. And I think that those kind of like separations are where a lot of critical teams are going to like be able to find a lot of offense, even if it kind of like seems like a slim margin. I think that those just really kind of method-based debates are places where you can juice out a lot of the mutual exclusivity between your argument and theirs in a way that makes it a lot easier for the judge to understand like the lines that are drawn in the sand between the two arguments and make a better choice based off of those things. And so hopefully that this video and the others will be really helpful in guiding you in the way in which you're able to use racial capitalism on this resolution, and hopefully you'll tune in for more. Thanks.